Going to go straight to the passage today. Today we're in Matthew 27, and we're also going to take a little bit from Matthew 28. Matthew 27, verse 62 says, "The next day, that is after the day of preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered before Pilate and said, 'Sir, we remember how that impostor said while he was still alive, after 3 days, I will rise. Therefore order the tomb to be made secure until the third day, lest his disciples go and steal him away and tell the people he has risen from the dead, and the last fraud will be worse than the first.' Pilate said to them, 'You have a guard of soldiers. Go, make it as secure as you can.' So they went and made the tomb secure by sealing the stone and setting a guard." And going also to chapter 28. So Jesus has come back from the dead, and he's told the disciples, and the guard knows that this has happened, and they go and talk to the Pharisees and say what has taken place with Jesus not being in the tomb, at least. And this is what the Pharisees say. "While they were going, behold, some of the guard went into the city and told the chief priests all that had taken place. Jesus is no longer in the tomb. And when they had assembled with the elders and taken counsel, they gave a sufficient sum of money to the soldiers and said, 'Tell people his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble.' Because if they found out that, or if the governor found out that the body had been stolen, it was probably execution for them. So they were trying to buy them off and putting their best interest in front of them to tell this lie. So they obliged. So they took the money, did as they were directed, and this story has been spread among the Jews to this day." This is the word of our Lord. This exchange in Matthew 27 and 28, when I first read through it as I was thinking about this message, really struck me. Because there is this constant narrative in the Gospels that the Pharisees are constantly at odds with Jesus. And we've seen it kind of escalate throughout the Gospel of Matthew, especially when Pastor Sam talked about Matthew 23, when Jesus lays down all these harsh judgments on the Pharisees. And you kind of understand the Pharisees have their doubts about Jesus, but you get to this place where the guards have their lives depending on guarding the tomb, and then the tomb is empty. And he said all along that I'm going to die and come back from the dead. And you read this story and you think, okay, if I were a Pharisee and I had all of this hostility toward Jesus because he's so ridiculous to say that he would be God, die and come back from the dead, and we crucified him, and now the tomb is empty, I might have some second thoughts. Okay, maybe this guy actually knew what he was talking about. And it's interesting, the polarity in chapter 28, because in the first part of the chapter, you have that Jesus came out of the tomb and the women tell the disciples, and they're kind of confused, but they're excited because, wow, Jesus isn't dead in the tomb. And immediately after that, you have the exact same thing happen. Now people go and tell the Pharisees the tomb is empty, but you get a completely different reaction. The Pharisees don't even bat an eye. It doesn't even cross their mind that the gospel that we talk about today, Jesus is alive, Jesus came back from the dead, Jesus is no longer in the tomb, that's what had just been told to the Pharisees. It did not faze them at all. Their immediate reaction was, okay, how do we cover this up? What do we do to write this off? All right, here's the strategy. We're going to pay off these people to tell a lie the body was stolen. And that's it. And you read through this, and you think, at least I think to myself, this is crazy. That they heard the story, that the tomb was empty, and it doesn't even faze them at all. They immediately go to how they could make up a lie to cover it up. And I think that most of us, if we read that story, and you're kind of scanning through, reading the Gospel of Matthew, and you get to that, it probably does hit you too. Like, I'm pretty sure if the tomb were empty, I would at least have a moment to say, the guy said he was going to die and come back from the dead. That doesn't happen very often, and he did it. So maybe there's something to it. But I would say that, especially in our Western context, we're really drawn to think that because this amazing miracle happened, belief in Jesus is bound to happen. But belief in Jesus as God, Belief in Jesus as the resurrected Lord is not just a propositional belief. It's not just another idea. We can talk about Jesus as a guy in history. We can talk about Jesus as a leader of a religious group. We can talk about Jesus as a good moral teacher. But for the Pharisees especially, but really anyone in that culture, but especially for the Pharisees, their whole thing with Jesus was that he claimed to be God. And especially if he came back from the dead, it's not just this, wow, that's cool. He was physically dead and now he's alive. And that doesn't mean anything for me. It's, he is God. And whenever we're faced with the reality of someone or something else being God other than ourselves, that's when it really becomes difficult. Because if Jesus is God, then I am not. Or if Jesus is God, then all of my concepts of God and how I live my life, because I forget the name's author, I think J.I. Packer said, the most important thing about a person is what they think about when they think about God. And the reason is because your concept of God determines pretty much every action in your life. It's the primary thing that you think about with how you live your life, with how you manage your money, with how you interact with your family, with everything. Because you're saying, this is the ultimate truth in my life. This is the ultimate God in my life. So it's saying that Jesus came back from the dead was not something the Pharisees could just say, even despite how incredible the miracle was. The implication of that is this isn't just a propositional belief up abstractly in the sky. This is a functional belief that will determine everything about my life. Who's in power? Who's in control? Who is the guide? Who has the final say over what I do? And I think if we understand that belief in Jesus as the resurrected Lord, is really that. It's not a propositional belief. It's a profoundly practical, functional belief that applies to everything that you do. I think we can empathize a little bit with the Pharisees. Because saying that Jesus is Lord is not just something you can idly say. Saying that Jesus is Lord says, what is my 5-year plan? Well, God, that's your 5-year plan. Saying Jesus is Lord is, how do I treat my wife or my husband? Jesus, how would you have me treat my wife or my husband? How do I treat my children? Jesus, how would you have me treat my children? How do I treat my parents? How do I treat my coworkers? How do I spend my time? How do I make big decisions in life? Where do I move? How do I manage my money? What are my ethics? Everything. Belief in Jesus means every single one of those questions is, Jesus, I want you to be first here. And that is hard. That is not a simple little flighty thing that you can say. That demands everything that you have. And in that sense, I can empathize with the Pharisees. I don't know all of their reasons, but saying Jesus was God meant a lot, especially for them. They had built their lives on the law. They had built their lives on their concept of the Messiah, and Jesus shattered all of that. So much of their lives would be upended if they said that Jesus is God. And I would say that this struggle of believing that Jesus is Lord in every aspect, in every moment of life, is a struggle for all of us. But I don't want to leave it there, because I would also say that I think that is the most important thing. Do you believe in Jesus in everything? And yet we constantly struggle with this. And what I want to talk about today is how do we, number one, why is that such a big problem? Why can't we just believe that Jesus is God all the time? Can you imagine what life would be like if every single time you were stressed, every struggle you faced, every problem in every aspect of your life, you were so secure in your faith and trust in Jesus that you just had an infinite, constant peace? Because I would tell you, if you really brought the reality of Jesus into all of those decisions, I think that's in some ways obtainable. But we know the reality that we struggle. We know the reality that no matter how much we want to have faith in Jesus, we struggle to think, I think I could manage my finances a little better, and I get stressed. I think what happened in my life with my job or with my family, if I had been in control, it would have been better if it had gone a different way. We struggle with this. How do we overcome this? How do we deal with this reality of wanting to believe in Jesus in everyday stuff of life, but we just don't? And so the title I have of my sermon today is, I Believe, Help My Unbelief. In so many ways, I think this is the Christian story. This is the ongoing thing that we are doing every day. We recited the creed this morning. We believe these things, but if you really think about it, if you really believed that about God, you wouldn't be stressed about your job. You wouldn't be freaked out about your paycheck. You wouldn't be freaked out about anything because Jesus, God, Son of God, Lord, is alive and real and active, and his Holy Spirit is moving in my life and everything. You'd be walking on cloud nine all the time, but we don't. So how do we get past our unbelief? Help my unbelief. I believe, help my unbelief. Well, the first thing I want to say, I guess in a way to encourage you guys, I've already sort of said this, is that I think we all struggle with this, but I would say we all struggle with this because one way you can define sin is unbelief. And the reality is, so long as we are constrained to this physical dying body and this physical dying world, sin will be a reality. We will see suffering, we will see loss, we will experience suffering, we will experience loss. And those things are competing beliefs in our lives. When we see suffering, we see pain externally. We see the economic injustice, or we see any kind of injustice, we see any kind of pain. It's okay and it's natural that in that moment we think, God, why? God, I think there's a better way to do this. I think if this economic plan had been implemented, if this educational plan had been implemented, if these people had helped in this way, if the wealth disparity in our world wasn't so bad, then this bad wouldn't have happened. And this other belief that education or money or strategy would work better than God begins to creep into our hearts and in our minds. And I've said this to you all before, but I think a better way to define unbelief, it's not just that you doubt God. It's that you believe something else more than God in that moment. Belief is just a stronger belief in something else. If you don't believe God can take care of the situation, it's because you think something else would be better suited for the situation. I don't think my money situation is going to resolve, and that naturally then pushes you to find other ways to get your money situation resolved. And so when we see the suffering and the death and the stuff in this world, there's all these things that say to us, God, I just don't know that you're doing this thing right. There's probably a better way. And so the sin in the world causes this unbelief, and then we struggle, and we're like, God, I think you can do this, but I don't know that I fully believe it. But aside from externally, we observe the things in the world, I really think that the primary source of struggle with this is internally. I've also said this to you all before. I always tend to try to paint the broad theological brush, but that's just how I am. The root of our fallen nature is that we want to be God. The root of the fall was we could eat this fruit and we could become like God. We could become equal with God. The root of our sinful struggle then is to be God of our own life. I want to be in control. I want to be the one in power. I want to be the one calling the shots. And so when we face stuff in life, I think the primary struggle is, God, if I had been in control, I would have done this better. And when we make that statement, it's a profound statement to say Jesus is Lord and mean it. You can say it in your theology class, you can say it here in church, you can say it and the words can just sort of roll off your tongue because all the liturgical practices that you've rehearsed. But to say and mean, Jesus, you are Lord, it strikes right at the heart of your broken nature. Because you're saying, Jesus, you are Lord, therefore, I'm not. Another way of understanding Lord is that, Lord, I am your slave. I belong to you. The language in the New Testament is strong in that sense. Slaves weren't like the slave trade we think of from Africa to the U.S., but in that time, they still did belong to the owner. And they worked for them. Doulos, the word for servant in the New Testament, was also a word for slave. That's what it means. If you say, Jesus, you are Lord, I belong to you. Everything about my life belongs to you. And there is something deep within us that scratches, that claws, that fights against that. That's the brokenness within us. We want to be the ones in control. We want to call the shots. We want to be God. And God is saying, I'm God. I'm Lord. Submit to me. And so I would say at the root of our unbelief, we can talk about all the plans we have for improved economics or improved education or improved justice system, and that's all great. But at the end of the day, so much of that is going to generate from, God, I don't know that I fully trust you as God of my life, so I don't trust you as God of this world. we have sin in our hearts, we have sin in our lives, and so we have this unbelief, and we struggle to just believe Jesus in every decision, every portion of our lives. And as harsh as that is, I also say that to encourage you, because we're all in the same boat. Because so long as we're in this physical body, in this physical dying world, sin is necessarily a reality. Christianity is not escapism. It's not this, I believe in Jesus to fix everything, and I just sort of remove myself from all the stuff. We are intimately involved with the stuff because we're physical, and this world is physical, and the suffering is going to be there, and that struggle is going to be there. And as Elder Gerald preached last week, Jesus sweat blood with the struggle. He believed in the Father. His whole life was grounded in belief in the Father, but that belief still had to be fought against the unbelief of, God, maybe there's a different way to fix this. I don't know, Lord, if I really believe that how you want to do this is the right way, so I'm wrestling with if there's another way to do that. And that wrestle, if it had actualized, Jesus would have sinned, because he would have said, God, I'm going to do something different than what you want me to do. Of course, the difference was Jesus, despite the agony and despite the struggle, stayed faithful to believing that God's way was the right way, the Father's way was the right way. But that struggle was even with Jesus, and so it is also with us. But talking about Jesus and talking about us, this is the struggle, this is the reality. What do we do about it? How do we overcome this? How do we deal with believing but overcoming my unbelief? My answer to that is pretty simple. Believe in the resurrection. The resurrection. And I want to read from, and I don't have it on the screen, but I want to read from 2 Corinthians 7 through 10. So Paul has just been telling the Corinthian church that he had these surpassing great visions, basically being called to the fourth heaven and seeing all these incredible things. It's a pretty well-known passage about his thorn in the flesh, but I really believe it has something profound to speak to us today. So Paul says, to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest on me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Notice something that Paul does that I believe any of us do. When we're struggling with unbelief, when we're struggling with something, some suffering, some problem in our life that we don't want to deal with, what do? God, take this away. I am physically uncomfortable, I'm emotionally uncomfortable, I'm spiritually uncomfortable, I'm in pain, I'm suffering, this is difficult. Take this away. What does Jesus say in the garden? If this cup may pass from me. This suffering is unpleasant. I want you to take it away. And that is our gut reaction when we're facing difficulty or facing problems. And God's response to Paul is so profound. And I think it gets to the heart of so much of what our unbelief and our belief struggle is. We want God to just take it away. But if we just have God take it away, it's not about God, it's about us. It's about my comfort. It's about what I want. It's about what seems easiest for me. And God says that Paul, that's not the point. The point of your suffering is not just so that you can remove your suffering. The point of your suffering is so that you can learn to depend on me in your weakness. The point of suffering is that you can know that even in your suffering, I am enough for you. The point of your suffering is that I am God and you are not, and that you need me. Because if God were to just take away every single piece of suffering, every single piece of difficulty, guess what? I guess, God, I don't really need you all that much, because everything is comfortable and everything is great and everything is fine. I'm never weak, I'm never needy, I'm never dependent, so I don't need you. And in our sinful, independent hearts, I think that's a lot of what we want. God, I don't want to have to deal with all this stuff. I want to be the one in control. I want to have the final say. And if I had the control and had the final say, obviously I wouldn't go through suffering, wouldn't go through problems. It's about me. It's not about you. And Paul's saying, I'm uncomfortable. Why don't you take this away? And Jesus comes to him and says, it's not about you, it's about me. Your weakness is not just so that it can be pushed away. Your weakness is so that you can depend on me. And even more so, because at the core of the Christian faith, is the death and resurrection of Jesus. The suffering and death and resurrection of Jesus. That if you want to know what it's like to be like Jesus, if you want to know what it's like to depend on Jesus, you need to know what it's like to depend on the Father, even in your weakness, even in your struggle, even in your suffering. Now, there's a lot of different things that we could draw from that, but I still think that we could see that and we say, well, maybe that's still a little unsatisfactory, or that's a little harsh, or that doesn't really speak to the issue the way that I want it to. And I would say there's some merit to it, because if you think about it, Jesus is on the cross in Matthew 27 in the gospel that we're walking through, and I believe it's the only one where Jesus doesn't have the really high and mighty statement where he says, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they do. The only thing that Jesus says on the cross in Matthew 27 is, why have you forsaken me? The only thing Jesus says in Matthew's gospel when he dies, when he's at the peak of his suffering, is, God, where are you? What's going on? This is terrible, and that's it. And what I would say to that is, number one, it is the resurrection that deals with our suffering, but there's something very profound happening when Jesus says that on the cross. So one way to define sin is unbelief. We don't believe what God is doing. We don't trust what God is doing. We trust something else. But when Jesus died on the cross, he took all of the death and all of the stuff to the cross, and when he resurrected, he overcame all of it. So that the real truth of eternal life, of resurrection, of the truth and the abiding with Christ for all eternity, that is the real truth now. After Jesus rose, I don't care what you face. I don't care how much you suffer. I don't care what it is that you encounter. The resurrection is now the ultimate truth. Because the death of your body and the death of this world has been overcome by the death and resurrection of Christ. You won't be in a position where you could genuinely say, Lord, why have you forsaken me? Because of what Jesus did. And this is the profound thing. On the cross, Jesus bore the full weight of our sin. And one of the biggest things of our sin, the primary thing of our sin, was death and separation from God. And this may be bold to say, but I think that was one of the few, if only, moments there was justified unbelief. Because in that moment, it wasn't like us. We have the hope of the resurrection. No matter how bad it is, the resurrection is always true. But in that moment, the full weight of death was on Jesus. The full weight of separation from God was on Jesus. And the full weight of actually genuinely feeling forsaken by the Father was on Jesus. Because that is what the real weight of our sin is. When you struggle with unbelief, when you struggle with your suffering, when you struggle with your problems, what is that feeling you have? Hopelessness. It's futile. It's overwhelmingly, paralyzingly oppressive. And there's nothing I can do. There is no hope to get out of this. I feel forsaken. That is a lie. That's the lie of sin, because Jesus overcame it, but Jesus did experience that. For Jesus, it was the truth. In that moment, he experienced that hopelessness, that paralysis of fear and the unknown and the separation from God. In that moment, he was forsaken because he took on death. He took on our death, took on the death of the world, separation from God. But for you, Jesus did that so you never genuinely have to feel that way. You will not be in a place where you are genuinely, authentically forsaken by God, because the hope of the resurrection is always there. Now, that doesn't mean you won't feel like it, but the truth of it is forever. And Jesus went through that so the truth of that could be forever for you. So the resurrection, no matter what weakness you face, no matter what suffering you face, no matter what struggle or pain or discomfort you face, whatever unbelief is fighting your belief, that belief of the resurrection is sufficient to overcome all of it. Because Jesus took on the full weight of that unbelief and that feeling of actually being forsaken. You don't ever have to be forsaken. That belief is enough. Now, here's the other thing about it. That belief is enough, but as Jesus said to Paul, it doesn't just magically escape you from the physical suffering of this world. There's still suffering. There's still discomfort. There's still the yearning and the angst of our resurrected bodies that have not yet been given to us. But there is always hope in and through the brokenness and the suffering and the struggle. And that's the beauty of Christianity. That's the beauty of the resurrection. It doesn't escape all of your stuff, but it doesn't leave you stuck in all of your stuff. No matter what you're struggling with, the resurrection is sufficient. But no matter what you're struggling with, the resurrection empathizes with your struggle too. Because God knows the full weight of your physical struggle. God knows the full weight of your physical suffering. It's not escapism. It's not, we don't really deal with this stuff in this world. And it's not fatalism, and this world does genuinely stink, and there's just really nothing we can do about it but just try as hard as we can and hope for the best. The resurrection is hope, and the resurrection is real in the midst of the stuff and the brokenness. And so I would say to you, whatever you're struggling with, whatever you're dealing with, and I get this, we all get this, in that moment of weakness, it's okay that your impulse is going to be, God, just take it away. Just don't want to deal with it. I believe he would come back to you and say, I'm not just going to take it away, but you need to believe the resurrection is enough to sustain you. I am enough to sustain you. My hope is enduring and infinite and everlasting and will be enough to sustain you in and through it. And it means you'll probably come out of it, and I don't know how long it'll be, but that's not the point. The point is the resurrection belief in the resurrection is enough to sustain you. To give you that hope, to give you that peace, to give you that joy, to give you that life. Because Jesus went through that feeling of suffering, forsakenness, so that you don't have to. So if you feel that coming on you, that is a lie. The resurrection has conquered that. Believe in the resurrection and you can conquer it too. I have a video that work out. I think a big gap in our theology in the West is, I don't know how great of a theology of brokenness and weakness we have. Because when it comes to performance, or it comes to preaching, or it comes to really anything, we, I think, struggle having a hard time reconciling suffering and difficulty with the gospel. Is it going to work? Okay. This is a story of a guy that I just believe exemplifies. Just because of your weakness and your struggle does not in any way undermine the purposes and the truth of the gospel.
I wasn't ready. I have no arms and no legs, but I'm very thankful that I have my little chicken drumstick here. People freak out when they see me for the first time. It's so cool. I was at a water slide all by myself. Everyone obviously at the bottom of the slide is looking up and waiting for other people to come down, and here I come and they're freaking out. They're like, you know, like this. And I was so tempted to look at myself and go, what happened? You know? And there were times where I sort of looked at my life and thinking, well, I can't do this and I can't do that. And you keep on concentrating on the things that you wish you had, or the things that you wish you didn't have. And you sort of forget what you do have. And there's no point, I believe, in my life where I wish I had arms and legs, I wish I had arms and legs, I wish I had arms and legs, because wishing won't help. But what I've seen in life are just a couple key principles, and the first thing that I've seen is to be thankful. It's hard to be thankful, man. I tell you, when I was 8 years old, I sort of summed up my life and thought, I'm never going to get married. I'm not going to have a job. I'm not going to have a life of purpose. What kind of a husband am I going to be if I can't even hold my wife's hand? It's a lie to think that you're not good enough. It's a lie to think that you're not worth anything. Oh boy. Woo! It's freezing, I can't feel my hands. I love life. You know, so many people come and say, how come you smile so much? And I'm like, well, it's a long story. But it's very simple at the same time. You see, it's very hard to smile sometimes in life. There are things that happen that you don't know and you don't understand, and you don't know if you're going to get through it. You know, you go through your storms in life and you don't know how long this storm's going to be. And today I want to share with you some principles that I've learned in my life that you can use in yours. Being patient is beautiful. I tell you, it's the hardest thing. But I realize I may not have hands to hold my wife's hand, but when the time comes, I'll be able to hold her heart. I don't need hands to hold her heart. You know, it is scary to know how many girls have eating disorders. It is scary to know how many people are just angry at life because of their situation at home and angry at others. It's scary to know how many people actually feel like they're worth nothing. Every single girl right here, right now, I want you to know that you are beautiful. You are gorgeous just the way you are. And you boys, you're the man.
Part of what he doesn't share in there, I just want to give like a blip of his what he does for a living, but he is a very devout Christian, and he leads an evangelistic team that goes around the world. They've preached over 500,000 people. And so this was his school setting, but his whole context of value and sense of purpose and God's purpose in his life is all about God and all about Christ. And we look at weakness and our assumption in so many ways, and what he touches on in so many different ways, right, is that we look at this and we think all the things we don't have, all the things that can't work, all the things that make this seem like, God, you must have messed up here. When the reality was God used something infinitely beyond what we could imagine if we focused on the weakness to accomplish his purpose. He talks about it in his testimony. He talks about the story of the blind man when the disciples say, what did this man do that God's basically punishing him? And he read this story when he was about 9 years old. And Jesus' response is, he's not being punished. He was born blind to show the works of God. And that passage became the verse that pretty much defined his life. He said, I see this, God, as how you want to use me. So I don't know what your weakness or your struggle or what you carry today is, but the hope of the resurrection and the purpose of the resurrection and the truth of Christ will work in and through your weakness. It's part of how it is. Let's pray. Lord, I thank you that you take us just